Good morning and welcome to Rising. We've got a great show for you today. Top of our minds is some reaction to the results in Michigan, which we're very eager to discuss. I bet you're eager to discuss them.
Yes. Yes, I am, Robby. You have read me well. As you might be aware, Republican and Democratic voters in Michigan took to the polling booth to cast their primary ballots yesterday. President Biden won his party's primary with a whopping 81% of the vote. However, the big story here is this: 13% of Democratic voters, or over 100,000 people, voted uncommitted. For reference, President Biden's 2020 victory in Michigan over Trump was by just 150,000 votes. Pro-Palestinian activists called on Democrats to vote uncommitted in protest of President Biden's blanket support of ongoing Israeli military operations in Gaza. In Dearborn, Michigan, where the state's Arab American population is the highest, Biden outright lost the vote to uncommitted, with 56% of voters choosing not to support the president. Representative Rashida Tlaib led the push against Biden, telling press yesterday, quote, "The war on Gaza is a deep moral issue, and the lack of attention and empathy for this perspective from the administration is breaking apart the fragile coalition we built to elect Joe Biden in 2020. In a victory statement, President Biden thanked primary voters for exercising their voice. He completely failed to mention, however, the elephant in the room, the war in Gaza.
Meanwhile, spokespeople for both the Israeli government and Hamas have distanced themselves from Biden's primary eve assertion that a ceasefire in the region could be reached as soon as this Monday. One IDF source told CNN they were surprised that Biden used the word Monday and the word ceasefire. And a Hamas spokesperson said of the deal, quote, "There is nothing." Joining us now to weigh in on all of this and more is Michael LaRosa, former special assistant to President Biden and former press secretary to First Lady Jill Biden. Great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
So how are you reacting to the results from Michigan? There's a lot of commentary going on right now on social media. Obviously, he did win, of course. There's no one really running against him. But this uncommitted total seems somewhat significant to me as a protest against some of these policies, particularly the Middle Eastern approach. Do you think this is going to cause any consternation at the White House?
Well, I think it should, because it's a reflection of some dissatisfaction, a lot of dissatisfaction in an important swing state where young people and progressives and the Arab American community, the Muslim community, were important to a very small marginal victory in 2020. I kind of look at it two ways. There's a problem. That's obvious and that's clear that there are some work to do in Michigan. That said, there's a lot of unknowns. Biden did not get 90% of the voters in the New Hampshire primary in 2020. Didn't vote for Joe Biden. 80% of the Democrats in the Nevada caucus did not vote for Joe Biden. He won those states in the general election. It's really hard to take last night and make conclusions about the general election. What I would say is more concerning to me is the level of enthusiasm that Republicans had last night, about 40% increase over Democrats. That's a little bit concerning to me because Democrats had more of the spotlight on them than somewhat non-competitive primary for the Republicans. So that's concerning to me.
Well, I think the difference here would be that a state like New Hampshire isn't a must-win swing state that can determine the outcome of the presidency.
Al Gore would disagree with you.
All right.
Al Gore would disagree.
We all know what the prediction map, the map to victories are for Joe Biden, and they run through a state like Michigan in particular.
Sure.
Now, when you look at the voting margin, the goal of the uncommitted camp was to get 10,000 uncommitted votes last night. They got 10 times that, 100,000, and even lost in this place in Dearborn, Michigan, where there's the highest concentration of Arab American voters.
Yeah.
And many polls have pointed out that it's not just Arab Americans. While this effect might be particularly acute in Michigan, certainly there are multiple demographic groups, including every single religious demographic group, including Jewish Americans, support a ceasefire more than they disapprove of the ceasefire. Catholics are at the top of the list after Muslims for supporting a ceasefire. We've had a huge number of Black Americans express their frustration with Biden's approach in Gaza. So this is an effect that we might see repeated acutely, or maybe less acutely than in Dearborn, Michigan, but in meaningful ways, given that the vote margins in some of these states are close. Joe Biden has not been able to break away from Donald Trump, who has been besting him in many a national poll and in these important state-by-state polls all around the country. So I would expect there to be alarm bells going off in the White House. But when you watch the mainstream coverage last night, you saw something different. You saw, it seemed, a continuation of folks saying, we're making excuses, but look at all these other good things that Biden has done. We're hoping this is going to wane by the election time, and that we're not really going to get into the substance of what people are reacting to that's causing them to vote this way. And then you saw in Biden's statement, there was absolutely no mention of the core issue that has provoked this kind of response to him in Michigan. So you say that Biden should respond, but do you see any evidence that Biden is going to be responsive to these concerns?
I think he's doing everything he can. I think nobody understands how pained people are more than Joe Biden. The guy is probably the most empathetic president who's ever sat in that chair when it comes to people who are really struggling with pain, grief, loss, and really and violence and genocide, essentially. That said, it is. I struggle myself with whether, and I'm just playing devil's advocate. I'm no foreign policy expert, but I do struggle with whether a small part of a small community or a subset of the electorate in one state should determine our foreign policy. I don't know if that's necessarily healthy for the entire country, and would there be a focus on Michigan's dissatisfaction if those communities were in California or Mississippi or somewhere else. It happens to be a swing state, and that's why we're talking about it. But if those pockets of dissatisfaction were in non-competitive general election states, would we be focusing on it?
Well, let's talk about that, because 67% of all likely voters support a ceasefire. 67%.
Well, I saw some polling that went contrary to that yesterday from Harris poll that I want to talk about later in the show. But I mean, go ahead and finish your thought.
I'm reading from the most recent Data for Progress poll. Among Democratic voters, voters, that number goes up to 77%.
Sure.
Moreover, there seemed to be some indication, and this is somewhat speculative, that because Joe Biden famously in that ice cream eating moment a couple of days ago threw out the idea that he thought a ceasefire was pending, that was perhaps bait for the population here in Michigan to say, hey, to the extent that you're going to participate in this uncommitted campaign, know that there's a light on the horizon, something around the corner. And as we know now, as we read in the read just a few minutes ago, both Israel and Hamas are saying there's nothing to that claim, seeming to suggest that Biden might have been going for a little bit of a bid to get voters on his side.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear what he did there.
Look,
we can all call this bait a spade.
The timelines for both men, for their political fate, are on two different tracks, right? Bibi wants the war to continue because as soon as it's over, his political fate could come to an end.
That's right.
Joe Biden wants this war to end because he has an election coming up as well.
Does he? Does he want the war to end? Because you speak about his integrity and his grief, his compassion.
Everybody wants the war to stop. Nobody wants war. Everybody wants a ceasefire. If you're asked in a poll, do you want a ceasefire? The answer, of course, is
yes. I pulled up this poll. Well, this is from Harvard Harris, and these results surprised me based on what you say about the polls. But in this one, 67% backed a ceasefire only after Hamas is removed and the hostages are freed.
But this is
78% back Hamas's removal from Gaza.
This includes the release of hostages, but that's the problem. There was a ceasefire deal just a couple of weeks ago that Hamas put forward that said a complete exchange and release of hostages in exchange for a permanent ceasefire, and Israel has made it clear that under no conditions do they want
removal of Hamas as well.
Under no conditions do they want a permanent ceasefire.
Let's just take the politics out of it for 1 second, though. After 9/11, would we have wanted another country to tell us, no, don't respond? This community in our country, Israel, we don't want you to respond to the attacks on September 11th. Who are we to say they should not defend themselves when those hostages aren't even released yet?
Well, we're the ones that are providing them with billions of dollars of aid that are being used to conduct humanitarian crisis.
We are one country that does. With 15% of their budget comes from their military budget comes from us. Not all of it.
So then you can't have it both ways, though. The argument is that Israel can conduct its war and conduct its what's been described as a plausible genocide without American aid.
We've never had to condition aid.
In which case?
We've never had to condition aid before. Now, they've taken some steps, President Biden has, in the West Bank to condition some aid that we're seeing over in the West Bank.
What do you mean we never have had to condition aid before? Because, in fact, aren't we violating the Lee law by not conditioning aid to Israel the way we condition aid to every other power on their not using that aid
Israel
to conduct
has
humanitarian
always been
offensives.
exempt. Israel has always been exempt from us because they are the only democracy in the Middle East.
All right, well, that's questionable. Lebanon is a democracy in the
Lebanon?
Middle East, and a apartheid state is not, in many people's eyes, described accurately as
I think
a
the
democracy.
Palestinian state was considered a democracy because they had free elections about 15,
Let me ask
20
you
years
another.
ago.
I want to ask you something else before we got to go.
Sure.
We talk a lot on the show about the perception that Biden's mental acuity is decreasing. There's been a number of incidents in recent weeks where he's misremembered an anecdote, substituted the wrong word, or when talking about loses his train of thought when giving a speech. In fact, when trying to reassure people that he's not going to lose his train of thought. The Robert Hur statements, obviously, about how he's a sympathetic, forgetful old man, and that's why we're not prosecuting him, really kicked this off again. You know, you've spent time with him, actually, so you might know. And also he does so many fewer interviews than past presidents. Is this a real issue? Is it getting worse? And do you think he should try to, if he wants to reassure people actually that he's still all there, he's still functioning, can still communicate, why is he not doing, across the wall media interviews, even hostile media interviews, so that people know he is still capable of communicating?
I'll connect this to Gaza because I think it speaks to both of his vulnerabilities. First of all, my experience in sort of the traveling bubble of the Bidens for 3 years, the campaign in the White House, no, the answer is the guy is as sharp as hell. I've never seen anything like that. It just wasn't my experience in private or in public. I never saw him.
Is that recent? Just out of curiosity, because people have spoken to it.
I left the White House in 2020, at the end of 2022. So I was on the campaign for a year and then in the White House for almost 2 years. It just wasn't my experience. Now, what I would say is I can't defend the media strategy because I don't think we would be in this place if he had been more accessible for the last 2.5, 3 years. If he was confronting his vulnerabilities and confronting his weaknesses, which is this perception that he doesn't have the ability to serve, that's what he needs to be doing. Those mistakes that are very human mistakes, by the way, that his opponent makes as well, would not be as amplified if he was doing more and engaging more with the media, engaging more with the public. It's not the press that needs to see him. It is the public. It is the voters that need to see him and show and tell why he is able to do this job and why he can continue to do it. As I said the other day to the New York Times, he's been the most consequential president in my lifetime in terms of tangible results and getting stuff done in office. That said, there's vulnerabilities. He needs to confront them. He needs to do the same thing. If it were me, this is the most, as I said, the most empathetic person who's ever had that chair. He should be going to Dearborn and talking to people and making his case and confronting sort of the problem that he has in a place like Michigan. Hiding does not, or ignoring the problem does not help it. He should go there and he should talk to folks there.
Yeah, just on that sympathy point, I do want to drill down on that because the question is whether or not that, as opposed to some other factors, are driving his decision making here. He has eyes. He knows what's going on in the world. He obviously is aware of what just happened in Michigan. But even though there have been protests at every event, basically, that he's been going to for the last few months.
Incumbency is messy. Very messy. You don't please everybody. You can't make everybody happy.
Right, but this isn't about not pleasing everybody. This is about a majority of Americans that look at what's happening in Gaza and are saying very clearly, as was expressed in the vote in Michigan last night, we don't want this to continue. This is not American policy that we support. We don't understand how this benefits the American people. And the question I have for you is, should we be looking at Biden's personal empathy and his personal life experiences to try to figure out why it is that he is so willing to ignore what the majority of his base actually wants him to do in this instance? Or might it have something to do with that fact that he tops the list of contributions in the Senate from when he was a senator from AIPAC and other Israel-affiliated donors?
Most of the Democratic Party is. Most of the Democratic Party.
The list.
Most of the Democratic Party is.
Tops the list, though, Michael.
Okay, but most of the Democratic Party
has described himself as a committed Zionist throughout his political career.
I think he would be the first to tell you he's been a loyal supporter of Israel for a really long time. I don't think that's news to anybody. But again, we have to sort of separate the. Does he understand what some would say his base is shouting at him? I'm sure he does. They're not ignorant to reality, but politics and the noise, and just because you raise the volume on the noise, does not make it in the best interest, the national security interest of the country. Foreign policy and diplomacy is a lot more complicated than just saying we don't like violence. Well, you know what? Israelis don't like violence either, and they were attacked.
More Jewish Americans support a ceasefire than don't support a ceasefire.
I get it.
This isn't just about.
I get it, but I don't want a doctor making decisions about my life because of polling, and we don't make decisions as a country based on polling.
Michael, this is about Biden's ability to win the election. So are you saying that it is legitimate? And maybe I think this is important to say because the argument right now that's being made is that by some of these pundits that are more in the Biden camp on mainstream television is, well, these protesters, these people who have lost family members in Palestine, they're going to be worse off if Trump wins, and it's going to be their fault if Trump wins. If Biden, though, in your kind of framing, believes that it is in the best security interest of the United States of America to continue supporting Israel as it conducts what has been described as the ICJ as a plausible genocide and loses the election as a consequence, can you honestly say that's on the fault of the Palestinian Americans and Arab Americans who declined to vote for him? Isn't that just a choice that Biden is making?
Well, it's a choice that they're making. He has to go make his case to them, but they will have a choice in November between Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
It seems like they've made their choice clear, and so we'll all see what the outcome there is.
Yeah, again, I don't know if we can take away last night. I believe that it's a problem. Last night was a problem. I don't know if it's necessarily going to translate into 100,000 people supporting Donald Trump. I don't know if that's...
They don't have to. They just have to stay home or vote for a third-party candidate.
And you know what? Our elections have consequences. We saw the consequences of a Trump presidency, and they'll have to own up to that, and they'll have to take responsibility for not voting for...
Just like all the Biden voters have to take responsibility for the ongoing genocide in Gaza right now.
Well, there's genocide all over the world, yes, and we don't get involved in that.
But we are involved in this one because we give more money to Israel than any other country in the world, right?
They have been an ally for over 70 years, yes, correct.
More Rising right after this. We appreciate it.